Back again today on another beautiful EPDM roof. Alright, doing a general inspection today. So we've got some clogged drains, pretty typical. Lack of maintenance. Alright, we know it's 16 mil EPDM. Now, one of the problems that we're going to have here is whenever you have an angle transition, depending on manufacturer, it changes. Some would want this plated, but all of them want a 90-degree angle slated. That should have some form of reinforced underlayment securement strip, or what they could have done is plate the field into the wall and then run a separate wall flashing. As you can see here, that's not even properly glued up. Looks like they just tucked it up underneath here, and so there's no securement there, so that needs to be plated. Ideally, depending on how well this was glued, yeah, it's glued to the base, so there's not much you can do there. You're gonna have to plate it and then put a new membrane over it. Then we've got our seams that we need to look out for. So that's a little close to the 6-inch rule, but so when plating these, they have to stay 6 inches back from this edge and from this edge, but no more than 12. So that plate needs to be somewhere kind of in that range. Given it's just a taper system, that's not going to be a major issue. It's something that if that's the only issue on the system, no forced correction, but if there's other things, it can move a repair into a replacement field. Alright, so we've got Carlisle EPDM for sure. It's pretty abundantly present from that, but sometimes they'll use separate manufacturer for the details just because they're pulling what's out of stock. So we've got big bubbles there, so it's a little sticky. So what I'm guessing is that they put a little bit too much primer, didn't let it dry properly. They didn't roll in properly. No seal there, no seal there. Yeah, that's definitely Carlisle. They got the right idea with the black lap sealant on the cut edges. Yeah, I'm not going to say this is the worst flashing I've ever seen. It's actually pretty typical. And just to see, always just as a precaution, hey, there's some HVAC work that needs to be done. There we go. Can never tell if it's taking a photo or not. Cricut seems to work well. There's still quite a bit of debris, especially for something that is less than a year old. Still got a lot of these caps. Looks like none of them were replaced. That is part of the deal. I'm all for patching a wrinkle. If you're going to patch it anyway, what they should have done is cut that right here, laid it down smooth. If they had to, cut out both pieces and then run semi-cured or cured over it, then do T-patches as necessary. So we've got some rough edges there. So that's about how far you want your seam tape to stick out. You stick it out too far, first off, it's not getting wide enough range here. Second off, there's now a risk that this will start to split. So it's not good for thermal expansion and contraction. Eventually it'll lead to water entry, but what's even worse is this side here. So that's really bad. The stagger looks like it's about 25% on this row, but it's only 6 inches. Maybe closer to 8 inches in some spots. So you want that stagger to be 25% minimum. Some brands want you to do 50%, but 25% is kind of the minimum on that stagger. So this one starts here. This one should have been 2 to 4 feet out. That's where that should have started. Just your one-way exhaust here. So that's something an HVAC guy should have done. And then we've got a pipe boot here. So we've got 2 of these. And now, not only is that from a different manufacturer, because that's not a Carlisle, for sure. But it's an older boot. It's a 2012. So using a 12-year-old boot on a 6-month-old roof. What about over here? See, on both of them, they patched over where the manufacturing stamp would be. I don't think that's a coincidence. I also don't think Carlisle bothers to check things very well, though. So it probably went unseen. They put on their lap sealant but didn't smooth it properly. That's not too big of a deal. So, big gaps like this, but you'll notice the tape's there. So they didn't... What they did is they just stuck it on and then forced it into place. What they should have done is started on one end, started to peel, and just kind of rolled it into place. And then rolled the rest of it with a roller to stretch it in. And so the reason why you want to do that is for exactly this. If it's stretched too far, it starts to pull back, especially with modern Carlisle. The old pre-2011 Carlisle was a little bit stretchier. Seam tape is too far back, so that's going to have to be patched. That's going to have to be patched. But it doesn't really matter about that because they're going to have to redo every wall anyway. They're going to have to redo that anyway. I'm really having trouble believing this is only 6 months old when I see plants like that. Usually those take a couple years to grow. So that's making me wonder if either I was lied to by the building owner or the building owner was lied to by the contractor. Okay, you can see they had a wrinkle there that they cut out. But again, stagger isn't enough on this board, isn't enough on that board. Now, as far as the stagger issue goes, less wind resistance, less thermal resistance. Now, overall, what I'm going to say generally is that it's much like the plating, how the plating's wrong on every board. If those are the only things wrong, I'm not going to sit there and force them to correct it. But if they have to redo so much already, that's going to be what I use to help push it from a repair to a replacement. Now, another thing is that they stopped the board there. So they've got two partial boards. You should always put your partial up against the edge. They used a 4-foot board there as well. You got a dropped piece of slip flashing there that should have been pushed up higher. This is just a mess. And why would you lap seal one side but not the other three? That's a red flag right there, that they did something wrong right here. Look at that gap. It's just sealed shut. That's the only thing keeping that from leaking, is the lap seal hasn't broken yet. They did it in 4 pieces and still couldn't get it sealed shut. Should have been able to do it in 1 and do it right the first time. Same thing here. You can see there's an air gap there to push in all the way from here to here. So the only thing holding that shut, yet again, is lap sealant. Those were never replaced. Yeah. This company, and I'll pull up the records later, definitely relies on lap sealant more than they do on skill. Now here is an issue. You can see the seam tape here extends all the way to there. So that T-patch has to extend past that. So that's another patch that was missed. This curb has to be completely reflashed because they didn't fasten it properly around the edges. Yeah. So that has to be completely redone. Jesus. That is some bad work around the corners there. And my guess is there's a lot of lap sealant on here that was clearly put on the same day in a lot of areas. that were clearly put on a week or two later. And you can always, first off, the pattern's different. So that one was sealed and then smoothed in. This one was sealed and then swirled. And so definitely two different people doing it. So there's a lot of issues there. Overall, you know, that's not stretched properly at all. A lot of issues there. And then you've got the seam tape here, starting from there all the way to about there. So from here to about here needs to be stripped in. And then here it's too wide. So I want to say from about here, there's a bubble that wasn't rolled in properly. Wasn't rolled in. That's an overlap in seam tape. So that actually has to be T-patched either way. Wrinkle in seam tape, patched. Bubble, tears. I would just redo that all the way to the wall, because you've got this spot here. So all the way from there to there needs stripped in. Here's a cut in the membrane that needs stripped. Seam tape too short, that needs stripped. Seam tape too wide, seam tape too short, seam tape too short, too short, too short. That looks pretty good. Walls need to be redone, so I'm not worried about that. Seam tape too wide, too wide, too wide. So from about here out, workable. Why is there uncured out in the center here? That has to be cured. Uncured can't be used to patch holes or slices, and there's no reason to strip in the field unless there's a hole or slice. Stripped in. This all needs to be stripped in, and it go well. Nah, I guess that's acceptable, but we still need to strip in the seam tape all the way to this patch. Past it, actually. Yeah, I'm just gonna say strip in this whole seam. Again, installation's wrong. Okay, that's a slice that was put in because this board's not flat, because they're missing a fastener. Strip in from there to the patch, strip in, keep stripping, all the way to about here. That entire vertical has to be stripped in. You can see the bubbles popping already, and you can see the tear in the membrane. Random patch in the middle, looks like they plated it. Possibly something deleted. Unsure. That should have been a plate there to smooth it out. Okay, back to the seam. Too short, too long, bubble, too wide. I'd strip in this entire seam. Strip in this entire seam. Strip in that entire seam. Because this is too wide. It's not rolled in properly. That's not rolled in. That's got a cut in it. So the only part that's good is from about here to here. Too wide, too wide, too wide. So strip in that entire seam. Now, Carlisle. If this were TPO, this might be a little bit more. So ideally, there should have been something in this cricket. However, it's not necessary. It's not required. But it would prevent issues in the future if they would have either ran a row of plates and then run this separate, or if they would have ran what I would have recommended is double Russ. And so what that is, it's about a 9-inch or 10-inch wide strip, and you plate it right here about every foot, and it goes underneath the membrane. And then it's got a strip here, and it's got a strip here that it adheres to, And you would just run that all the way down both sides, and that would keep it nice and tight, reinforces it against wind, prevents pretty much any kind of issues they could come across. And again, we have debris that makes me believe this roof is a bit older than implied. 2012, I wouldn't say. Looking at those stamps on the boots, as they say 12. But I definitely... 40, 12. Yeah, maybe so. The more I'm looking, the more I suspect this roof is a lot older than it was. And I suspect the reason why is because I tell people, you know, if you're trying to go after your builder, it has to be relatively new. You don't want it to be more than 2 years. There are laws out there that you can go after them for longer than that. Like where I'm at here, you have 6 years. And let's say along those 6 years, you know, 2 months in, you know that the roof is bad, but you wait 5 years, that's going to be a problem. You need to report it within 2 years of discovering the issue, and you have 6 years to pursue from the completion date. So now what we're looking at here, let's say this is a brand new roof. Let's say it's still within the first year, which I don't believe anymore. You've got, but I haven't checked permit records. Redo that seam, redo that seam, redo that seam, redo that vertical, redo that vertical, redo that seam about halfway, redo that vertical patch. This just has some patchwork here, nothing too bad on that. Redo basically 2/3 of that seams. This was done and cured to begin with, so that's not a major issue, but you're gonna have to redo this vertical. So break it down, you're talking about 90% of all field seams. Pretty much every pipe flashing up here except 2, so that's 6 field wraps that now I'll wait. Dang plane. So 6 field wraps that need to be redone. The walls need to be redone. 90% of the seams need to be redone. The dryer exhaust. So even if these are tucked up and over, you still have to fasten them. And you can see where the old fastening holes were. Nothing was fastened. So both of those need to be fastened. And I'd also recommend replacing the hoods as a whole. Vent caps need to be redone. But that can be done by HVAC, so we may not be able to blame the roof. So, back to the insulation issue. Every board of insulation here is fastened wrong. That has to be 6 inches back. That one. Every corner one has to be 6 inches back. Again, we used a 4-foot piece. Some spots they use 4x4s, and some other spots they use 8x4s. I'm kind of wondering why. Like, it's definitely an 8x4 this row. And it goes back to a 4x4. Either way, stagger a 6-inch doesn't work. Then they've got a little filler roll of insulation down the center here. Oh, and look at the difference. So that's a taper. That's why they switched from 4x4s to 4x8s. It's because getting a 4x8 in the thicker sizes is a pain, and you have to wait for them to come in. But if you order them in 4x4, they're readily available at the local plant. So they ordered the 4x8s where they could, and then did 4x4s where there wasn't enough available. So it was based on availability. That doesn't excuse this hump here. That's above what you're allowed there. That should have been fixed. And you could just tell the sudden slope change. So that's not really excusable. Not something I would force them to fix normally, but we're now talking about 90% of seams, every curb, every wall. Haven't even checked the drains yet. Every pipe flashing that was hand done. And then look at this. you know, on the topic of quality, look at that buildup there. That was possibly an old pitch pan. In fact, look at the silver coating, so I bet that has a pitch pan on it that they just buried, that they could have cut out. So that pipe needs to be reflashed too. Take my photo of that. And then, last but not least, let's look at the drain flashing. Now, what some manufacturers will tell you is that that hole on the inside needs to be cut the same as the pipe. There you go. What our local requires is a 4-inch minimum. So that's actually correct based on the local building department. And here we get to see through the wall. Yeah, you see that? They just ran the membrane up loose and put this over it, which is not fastened nearly to standard. That's going to need a fastener every foot. So even if the walls didn't have to be redone due to the lack of plating and redone because of the lack of adhesive, they would still have to be redone because of the metal flashing not being on correctly. And you can see where the old fasteners were, and they would still have to be redone because this wood siding's faded. And what they should have done is replace it wherever the wood's bad and coat the rest, or just replace the whole thing, or put a metal cover over it. There's a few ways you can do it that would have worked. But you can see every joint's been caulked shut. So yeah, that basically sums up EPDM. You got your hand wraps or field fabricated flashing, your manufactured flashings, field fabricated curved flashing, which is done wrong to all hell. The only thing really done right here is the pipe drains, or I mean the roof drains, and they're clogged. But at least they run relatively correct. Insulation is plated wrong. Seams are taped up wrong. It's very easy to get that right, even without using chalk. But you know, a lot of guys use blue chalk on EPDM. I highly recommend blue, not red, for the record. This is just a pet peeve. See that line? That line goes under there. So, you know, they spun it around. That's just a pet peeve. But still, professionalism. And then when they came up on the center here, they misjudged where the center was. This side sits higher than that side. And so they just forged a piece. And it doesn't work. So I wonder... And the reason why is that this is not the center. Hold on just a sec. 3, 4, 5, 6. So the reason they had to fake it till they make it is because that's not the center. See, that's the back end of the 8th board, but that's the 9th board for this side. That's the 8th board. So the center would have fallen between these two. So the actual center's right here, and that's why that's so messed up. So that's just being cheap. You know, whether you want to say that they just didn't want to cut the back end off of all these, or maybe they didn't even have enough pieces to fill it in properly. So they just cut it and forced it into place, and look at how this goes in and out here. So they shaved it. That's what that is. And what that is you take the side of the ISO board and just shave it down until it reaches the height you need, even though it's too tall. And you cannot do that if you're going to adhere to it. You really shouldn't do it anyway. And if you do it, you should put the separator sheet in it, especially for, they used polyiso. And the reason you can tell that they use polyiso is that polyiso boards have these strands in them right there. So that tells you it's polyiso, ISO for short, for some. So we have to redo seams, walls, curbs, pipes. Honestly, this is one of those ones where there's so much that has to be redone. You might as well throw in the insulation issues and force a full re-roof, because there's so much wrong here. It's going to be simpler, easier, and more trustworthy to have the entire roof redone as opposed to trying to repair it to get it compliant. There's just too much done wrong. And quite frankly, you also got to ask yourself, on a company that messed up almost every step of every detail along the way, whether or not you want them to redo it. Usually my recommendation here is have them redo it with somebody who knows what they're doing, watching the entire time. So possibly hire a roof consultant, or maybe even hire another contractor. I don't recommend that because it never ends well, but it can be kind of funny to hire like a superintendent from another company just to come here and watch them do it. It's cruel, but it gets the point across. Alternatively, hire a consultant that knows what they're doing, preferably the one that failed the roof, to watch them the entire time and make sure they do it right. And depending, in some cases they're watching to make sure they do it right. In some cases they're training them how to do it right. It all just depends on how it went. Beyond that though, pretty simple EPDM roof, to be honest. This isn't the worst I've seen. This isn't the worst I've seen this month, but I get a chance to share this one because there's no active litigation or anything. While I am going to recommend replacement if it's still within a warrantable period, if this falls under Carlisle, that gap, if this falls under a Carlisle warranty that was inspected, with how old it is, it might be under Brett or Stephen Johnson. Kind of tells you the area here of Colorado. So I'm going to recommend, if it's under Carlisle's warranty and can be repaired under that warranty, it should be brought up to standard. Otherwise, the original contractor should be replacing it if it's still relatively new. And if this roof is older and outside of warranty, which I doubt it ever had one looking at it, I highly doubt it. I bet more that this is a material only warranty, and it's probably old enough that it's outside of the time you could sue for. I'm going to say recommendation, if this is just something that you're never going to get any money back, any savings on it, there is a way to large scale repair this, unfortunately, that will buy it another 10 years, maybe longer with proper care. But that's kind of the last ditch effort on a roof that there's no way to recover from. Personally, this is something that should have been caught early on so that they could go after the contractor, but I really don't believe that it's as old as I'm being told. I think it's much older. And we should check, because if it turns out that they signed a contract to get it done and that they're claiming this is the finished product, now we need to check to see if they pulled permits, if those permits were satisfied. If so, we can pull out, or we can try to go for fraud. If they didn't pull permits, if they didn't get any inspection done by the city, this roof is definitely not new. That's a different type of fraud. So one way or another, we either have a lying property owner or we have a lying contractor. What a fun little afternoon.